Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Um, Imagine a moment, it's thick with negotiation, right? Everyone's talking about a pause, maybe, possibly a way to step back from some really intense conflict.
Yeah, hope for a break.
Exactly. But then, right in the middle of all that comes this statement, and it sounds like the exact opposite of, actually ending the fighting.
Right. It's
Yeah.
quite jarring, potentially.
That's the tension we're really diving into today. We've got this fascinating piece of analysis here. It's an article that takes a really close look at a recent proposed agreement.
And some specific statements made around it.
Yes, particularly, it seems, from the Israeli prime minister. So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to try and understand the deeper strategic thinking.
What the source thinks is going on underneath.
Yeah, what the source argues is really at play here, looking past the sort of immediate headlines and the tactical moves.
It's a classic case, isn't it? Or at least the article presents it that way.
Right.
Where the stated position, within a negotiation might, according to this analysis anyway, reveal a much more embedded long-term strategy. It asks, is this genuinely about finding an end?
Or something else.
Or is it about something else entirely?
Yeah. And the statement the article really zeroes in on, it's attributed to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This was apparently during negotiations involving the American envoy Brett McGurk.
Right.
And it's quite striking. As the article presents it, this statement was sort of expected to come out upon the agreement itself. We will continue the war until the achievement of the objectives after the agreement.
After the agreement. That's the key phrase there. And the immediate analysis from this source is pretty crucial.
What do they say?
They argue this isn't just, negotiation posturing or like a temporary stance.
Okay.
This statement, in their view, it points to something deeper, an ongoing Israeli strategy.
So not a step towards peace?
Not seen that way by this source, no. Not towards a lasting settlement, but more like a tactical phase within something the article calls a continuous cycle of bloodshed.
Wow. Okay, so this potential agreement, it's not viewed as an exit ramp from the conflict at all.
Not according to this analysis.
Yeah.
Just another stop along the way, perhaps.
And the article connects this statement directly to what it identifies as Netanyahu's core conditions for maybe halting the intense fighting. What are those three key points the analysis highlights? And I guess, how does it interpret their purpose?
Okay, so the article links this willingness to pause, even temporarily, to three core points. And it interprets their purpose as serving that ongoing strategy we mentioned.
Right.
First, initiating the release of all hostages. Now, that's obviously central to any proposal, right?
Of course.
But the analysis stresses it's presented as contingent on, quote, strict Israeli conditions.
Strict conditions. Okay, got it. What's the second point the article raises then?
The second condition mentioned is delivering weapons for the army and removing the political leadership from Gaza. And the source views these demands as, well, squarely aimed at fundamentally weakening the military and political structures of the resistance there.
So not just a condition for a pause.
No, they see it reflecting an ongoing strategic goal, according to this interpretation.
Weakening the very structure.
Okay.
And the third point the article discusses, that one seems particularly significant in how it's interpreted. What's that?
Yes, the third one is implementing a plan to displace Gaza residents. The article uses the term trahil.
Trahil.
Yeah, and this is characterized by the source not just as some short-term demand, but as a long-term vision.
A vision. To do what?
The analysis sees it as intended to fundamentally and maybe permanently alter the demographic reality in the sector.
Okay, so if those are the stated conditions, and the core statement is about continuing the war after an agreement, this raises a really big question. How does the article frame this whole approach? Is it part of some larger philosophy?
That's precisely what the source argues.
Yeah.
It contends that Netanyahu's statement, the one about continuing the war, it isn't some kind of deviation. It's actually perfectly consistent with what the source identifies as the Israeli security doctrine's philosophy. They call it managing the conflict.
Managing the conflict, not resolving it.
Exactly. Dostaka Cohen. The source suggests the strategic goal isn't necessarily ending the conflict, but rather its long-term management within a very specific framework.
Managing the conflict. That's a really powerful term, isn't it?
It is.
And the article argues it's key to understanding everything else. So how does the source then view the proposed agreement itself within that managing the conflict idea? It doesn't sound like it's seen as a traditional peace roadmap.
Absolutely not. The article is quite blunt here. It doesn't see the proposed agreement as a roadmap to peace at all.
So what is it then, in their view?
They describe it as a station for restoring the hostages.
A station, like a train station.
Sort of. A temporary halt, a roof is the term used.
Yeah.
But one that's used, crucially, to achieve specific tactical objectives.
Ah, tactical objectives within the bigger strategy.
Exactly, within the broader management strategy.
Tactical objectives, like maybe using the pause to regroup or rearm.
Precisely. The source lists goals like applying pressure on Hamas, getting critical time to reorganize military structures, political structures too,
Okay.
and integrating it all into this strategy that combines, military actions with what the article calls settlement negotiation tactics.
It's settlement/negotiation. Interesting phrasing.
So from this perspective, the agreement is really just a means to an end within the ongoing management. It's not an end that leads to, resolution.
And the article tries to back this up, right, by looking at history. It's suggesting this kind of tactical use of agreements isn't new.
That's right. The analysis draws a direct line, or argues there's a line, between this approach and past agreements. It cites examples like Oslo.
Oslo, okay.
Arguing that these previous agreements were also used tactically, leveraged for strategic gains under this very same conflict management philosophy.
Any specific examples more recently?
Yeah, the article specifically points to the 2014 ceasefire. It argues that wasn't used to de-escalate permanently,
But rather
to regroup forces, intensify the siege on Gaza, and, importantly, facilitate the expansion of settlements. That's the source's claim.
Okay, here's where the analysis gets, really interesting, I think. The article highlights a significant danger it sees. This is based on recent leaks.
Yes, specifically mentioning a Reuters leak. They date it May 29th, 2025.
Okay, so what's the critical risk this source points out regarding this proposed deal?
The danger, as highlighted in the article based on these leaks, is that if a proposal is strictly limited, right, limited to just a temporary ceasefire and an exchange of hostages, but without fundamental accompanying guarantees, things like a full, verified withdrawal from Gaza or a concrete funded plan for reconstruction.
Then what? What's the risk?
Well, it leaves this crucial loophole, the source argues. This lack of guarantees, they say, gives Israel significant flexibility to just resume military operations once the temporary pause is over.
Wow. So essentially making the agreement itself a kind of tool
Exactly.
for potentially continuing the fight later?
That's the source's key point.
Yeah.
Without those solid guarantees, the deal risks becoming, and this is the article's phrase, a tool in hand.
A weapon in Netanyahu's hand.
Easily used, they argue, to facilitate the continuation of military action after just a temporary tactical stop.
That really does change the perspective on what an agreement like this might actually achieve, doesn't it?
It does, according to this viewpoint.
The article also delves into the internal political situation in Israel. How does this source see Netanyahu's stance serving domestic needs? What's the angle there?
Well, the analysis posits that Netanyahu's position is also, very carefully calibrated. It has to serve internal political requirements.
Like what?
It's seen as a way to gain time, is the phrase used, and allow for strategic repositioning, tusikosiu, domestically.
Gaining time for what, though?
Well, he faces considerable pressure, right, from his coalition partners, particularly figures like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich.
The hardliners.
Yeah, who are staunchly against concessions and strongly support continuing the war, expanding settlements, that whole agenda.
So accepting a temporary pause, maybe on the surface, could actually be a way for him to navigate those difficult internal politics.
That's the suggestion.
Without completely alienating his hardline base, especially if, as the source claims, it kind of aligns with this longer-term displacement goal they mentioned.
Precisely. The article suggests that moving forward with such a proposal could, buy him time. It might even garner some international favor temporarily,
Right.
while not necessarily requiring concessions that would break his coalition. Particularly if the plan, as the source interprets it, facilitates that long-term goal described as displacement.
But it's not clear-cut.
No. And it's important, the article itself includes a contrast here. It actually cites a New York Times poll dated 2025, which reportedly showed that while maybe 70% of Israelis supported Netanyahu at that point, a significant 80% were opposed to displacing Gaza residents.
80% opposed. So even according to the source, there's a complex, maybe contradictory domestic dynamic at play.
Definitely complex. That poll data the article mentions really highlights a potential disconnect, doesn't it?
Yeah. The analysis also brings up the strategic use of language.
Mm-hmm.
How does the source argue Netanyahu uses language itself as part of this whole strategy?
It's interesting. The article points out that Netanyahu often uses terms we associate with negotiation, maybe even reconciliation, like setio, seemingly interchangeably with very forceful terms, like defeating Hamas or restoring hostages.
So mixing messages.
Kind of. This strategic linguistic blend in the source's interpretation is seen as a deliberate tactic.
A tactic for what?
It's seen as a way to maintain an image of strength, resolve, the Yassira, the fighter image, while simultaneously attempting to frame the opponent as the one solely responsible for the lack of resolution. Jurosi, the opponent refuses to concede.
So it reinforces a certain narrative.
Exactly. The article argues this reinforces a kind of fortress state narrative and helps justify continuing military actions.
So the language isn't just describing the situation, it's actively trying to shape it to support the strategy.
That's the argument presented, yes.
And the article even notes, interestingly, that there are critical voices within the Israeli security establishment itself. It's not a monolithic view.
Yes, and that's an important piece of balance the source provides. It does mention that there are arguments coming from within the establishment.
Arguing what?
Arguing that the current strategy of depletion, or else this constant ongoing conflict, it's not actually leading to lasting security. These internal critics, according to the article, see it as creating a, quote, strategic and moral crisis.
A strategic and moral crisis. That's a powerful point to include from the source's perspective.
It is. Shows it's not a universally held view, even internally, according to this analysis.
Okay, so if we try and connect all of this now, put the pieces together for the bigger picture, what does this analysis argue is fundamentally being, overlooked or disregarded by this conflict management philosophy it describes?
Well, the article argues that at its core, this philosophy, this conflict management idea, which it sees as deeply embedded in Israeli security doctrine, inherently overlooks or maybe actively disregards fundamental Palestinian rights.
Such as?
Rights like the right to return, self-determination. These things, the source argues, are simply not factored into this particular approach.
So what's the goal then, if not peace?
The source's conclusion, its interpretation, is that the ultimate goal isn't some demographic shift towards a shared peace. It's about solidifying Israeli dominance.
Establishing dominance.
Yes, and the analysis warns this could potentially push the entire region towards a wider, even more dangerous conflict.
So, bringing this all together, what does this really mean? What's the core takeaway from this source's entire analysis?
I think the core takeaway from this article's specific perspective is pretty clear. The proposed agreement, when you view it through the lens of Netanyahu's statements and this underlying philosophy the source describes, it's interpreted not as a genuine step towards resolving the conflict, definitely not towards establishing lasting peace.
But instead,
it's seen by this analysis purely as a tactical maneuver, a move within a long-standing Israeli strategy focused on managing the conflict, consolidating dominance.
And critically,
according to the source, lacking the fundamental guarantees needed for any kind of just and lasting resolution.
Wow, okay. This deep dive into our source material, it really forces you, doesn't it, to look beyond just the immediate news, the statements, and try to understand the strategic philosophies that, well, according to this analysis anyway, might be guiding events. And if the driving force, as this article argues, really is about managing a conflict rather than definitively resolving it.
Yeah, what does that imply?
What does that inherently suggest about the potential for truly breaking these cycles of violence? It raises big questions.
It does.
And given this analysis, what deeper questions should we, as listeners trying to understand this incredibly complex situation, be asking? About the true nature, the potential outcomes of international efforts right now.
Definitely something to think about. What are the real goals? And are the mechanisms in place actually designed to achieve a lasting peace or something else?
Yeah, definitely something to think about.